and we're going to look at today's chess talk with me, Johnny Cockayne. And in order to talk about today's subject, I'm going to have to leave Edinburgh behind. And I hope you join me as we leave Britain and we travel to a more distant, a more foreign country. We travel across the sea to the land of Denmark. And in particular, we find ourselves outside a Danish nunnery. So listen carefully, we might hear some famous words. I need to get in character. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them. These are the words of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, when he's confused, uncertain, a little bit worried after the death of his father. And perhaps more importantly, as any British school kid will tell you, these are the words of William Shakespeare, a poet, a playwright from the 16th century who is still listened to and still read today. But how relevant is William Shakespeare to the modern British audience? Well, back in 2002, the British public voted to name the greatest Briton of all time. So that's in the entire history of the United Kingdom. And in that survey, conducted by the British people, by the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, Shakespeare came in 5th. Yes, in the entire history of British people, only 4 were considered to be greater than William Shakespeare. And I'm wondering if you can guess who they might be. Number 3 might surprise you. In 4th place, we had Charles Darwin, the scientist and naturalist. In 3rd place, it was Princess Diana. Now, I wonder if she'd make it into the top 5 these days, and I have to think, probably not. 2nd place, and with the hardest name for me to pronounce, we have Kingdom Isenberg Brunel, an engineer who changed the landscape not just of Britain, but of lots of places all over the globe. So they were 4 of the top 5, but who was number 1? Who is voted the greatest Briton of all time by the British public? If I tell you he was a politician and a war leader, you might guess, because you see, it was Winston Churchill. Although he's probably considered a more controversial choice these days than he was 18 years ago. Looking at these 5 people, what's really clear and obvious is that Shakespeare is the oldest of any of them. In fact, he's the only one who was both born and died before the invention of the photograph. Yet he's still remembered and still revered by British people today. In fact, in 1970, he was given a special honour. In 1970, Britain embraced, well, embraced is the wrong word, Britain adopted the decimal currency system, and we needed someone to go on the new decimal banknotes. So who was chosen to go alongside the Queen? Of course, William Shakespeare. And Shakespeare was on the £20 note for 23 years, between 1970 and 1993. And I'll be honest, I had to check my wallet earlier today because I thought he was still on there. Nevertheless, generations of British people have grown up with the face of William Shakespeare close to their heart and close to their legs as well. But although we all recognise William Shakespeare, I mean, he is very distinctive. He has that bald dome. He has the distinctive hairstyle, a little moustache and beard sometimes. We all look at his picture and say, that's Shakespeare. But is it? All of the images we have Shakespeare come from this Droeshout engraving, but this wasn't made till 7 years after he died. And it was made by someone who had never seen him when he was alive. So although we know that's what people of the era dressed in, we actually have no idea if this is what William Shakespeare looked like. And that's just one of the many mysteries that surrounds Shakespeare's life. And today in the Chess Talk, although I'll talk a little bit about his plays, what I'd rather do is focus on the man behind the mystery. And if we're going to do that, well, let's start at the beginning. As many of you will know, Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564, a small town just to the north of London. His father, Jack Shakespeare, was a glover or a glove maker for the rich and the wealthy, and his mother, Mary Shakespeare, came from a very affluent farming background. So Shakespeare was not born into poverty. He wasn't a noble, but he certainly wasn't poor. In fact, he had enough money, or his family had enough money, that he wasn't forced to work as a child. He didn't need to go and till the fields. Instead, Shakespeare was sent to grammar school, and we suspect he went to King's New School in Stratford. It would have been here that he was first taught Latin, and he was introduced to the Greek and Roman myths that would go on to be featured in so many of his later plays. It was definitely a dangerous time to be alive. 16th century Britain, oh, that was a time filled with plague and disease. And in the year that Shakespeare was born, 1564, 2/3 of children born that year never made it to their first birthday. So Shakespeare really beat the odds. In fact, Shakespeare had 7 siblings. 5 of them made it to adulthood, which is another example, another reason why we can tell that he came from quite a well-off background. So that's where he went to school. What did he do when he was older? Well, like many people, he got married. And in 1582, he married Anne Hathaway. No, not that Anne Hathaway. This Anne Hathaway, a lady 8 years his senior at 26 years old. There was a little bit of controversy around this because on the wedding license, Anne's surname is misspelt. It's spelt Whately, which has led some people to speculate that Shakespeare actually had 2 lovers and was originally planning on marrying someone else. In fact, Anne, who, as we said, was 8 years older than William, was pregnant when they got married. She gave birth less than 6 months later. So there is the idea that he was forced into marrying Anne Hathaway because he had done something he probably shouldn't. Now, the phrase shotgun wedding was not present during Shakespeare's time, with the shotgun yet to be invented. Nevertheless, shotgun wedding might be an appropriate comment to make. What I would say is back in the 16th century, spelling was not very good. And it's probably likely that Whately was Hathaway and that Shakespeare only had 1 lover. As well as Susanna, their first child, Anne gave birth to twins, Judith and Hamnet, 2 years later in 1985. And while both Susanna and Judith made it into adulthood, Hamnet sadly died, we think from plague, at the age of 11. So that's Shakespeare's early years, the first 21 years of his life. And the evidence for that is entirely based on 4 documents: the record of his baptism, not his birth, his wedding license, and the births of his 2 children. These are the only pieces of evidence we have about Shakespeare's first 21 years of life. But they're an absolute treasure trove compared to the next 7 years, because the next record we have of Shakespeare doesn't appear until 1592, when we find he is in London. So what did he do between those years? Those 7 missing years, which are often referred to as the lost years of Shakespeare. He could have probably done almost anything, but there are 3 very popular theories and they all involve him leaving Stratford, twice to go down south and once to go up north. And let's look at going down first of all. The first theory had him spending those 7 years working in London as a groomsman, looking after the horses of wealthy theatre patrons in an attempt to break into that theatrical world. A second theory also has him going to London, but rather than choosing to go there voluntarily, he was forced to flee Stratford after being accused of poaching deer on a neighbour's lands. It's quite possible the truth is somewhere in between, and he was forced to flee and ended up working with horses. We'll never know for sure. The third theory, the one that has him going north, has him going to become a schoolmaster in Lancashire, towards the north of England. And you might be thinking, why did he do that? Why not just become a school teacher in his hometown of Stratford? It would save a lot of money on lodgings. Well, the answer in part, if it's true, probably comes down to this lady, Queen Elizabeth I, or to give her some of her many nicknames, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, or as we called her here in Scotland, Good Queen Bess. Queen Elizabeth was queen when Shakespeare was born, and she reigned until 1603. She was many things, perhaps most importantly, she was Protestant. Now, in Britain, we have a rather complicated relationship with religion, and in particular, the conflict between Catholics and Protestants, two sides of the Christian coin. Queen Elizabeth was Protestant, and while we don't know for sure what Shakespeare was, we do have proof that his dad was Catholic. And if Shakespeare himself was Catholic, it wouldn't have been safe to practice his faith so close to London. Whereas by moving further north, closer to Scotland, where we were ruled over by Queen Mary, a Catholic queen, he would have had more religious freedom. There is also another reason why people suspect he moved up to Lancashire, and that's because on the teaching rolls of one of the schools there, we find a reference to William Shakeshaft. Now, Shakeshaft is not necessarily the same as Shakespeare, but if we look at the evidence, a spear and a shaft, they're quite similar. So there's a chance there's been some confusion. So we'll never know. Did he go up north? Did he go down south? Or did he even go abroad? So many of his plays are set in foreign countries. So many of his plays feature ocean-going idioms and expressions that many people suspect he was part of the British Navy for those 7 years. What I will say is in all of his plays, in all of his sonnets, he only mentions sailing or sailors 4 times. So if he did go sailing, he probably didn't enjoy it that much. So where did he spend those 7 years? We may never know. But we do know in the year 1592, he was found in London, England's capital city, its largest city, its smelliest city. It was a city that was full of life, but most importantly for Shakespeare, it was full of theatres. Because even though Queen Elizabeth occasionally cracked down on them, the number of theatres in London continued to grow and grow and grow. And that was perfect for someone like Shakespeare who wanted to appear on the stage. But certainly at the beginning, he was not the most popular person. I find it quite interesting that the first piece of evidence we have of Shakespeare's work is actually a criticism given here by Robert Greene, where he says, "There is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you. And being an absolute Johannes factotum, in his own conceit is the only shake scene in the country." Now, that doesn't sound very pleasant. A Johannes factotum is what today we would call a jack of all trades, someone who does a little bit of everything, but isn't great at any of them. Shakespeare was an actor, he was a poet, he wrote plays. Robert Greene wasn't impressed. But I also think Robert Greene wasn't objective, because you see, there is something that has always been at the heart of British society: class. Greene, Marlowe, and Nash were all university educated. They were known as the university wits. Shakespeare, as we've said earlier, was not university educated. So Greene would look down at him and would probably feel threatened by his rising success. And class is a very, very British thing. We can find it throughout all of Shakespeare's plays. Perhaps the most famous example is in Twelfth Night, where Malvolio, the steward, is mocked, is ridiculed for trying to rise above his class, for falling in love with his mistress, famously turning up dressed in yellow stockings. And I find it quite interesting that Shakespeare, someone who suffered from class prejudice, seemed to reinforce those stereotypes in this idea that everyone has their level within his plays. But there is another reading of it. When reading the Twelfth Night, maybe we're not meant to mock Malvolio for his actions, but instead we're meant to be disgusted by Sir Toby Belch and Sir Andrew Aguecheek, the drunken nobility who cause him to go on this spiral. So rather than looking down on people from different classes, Shakespeare was casting aspersions at those higher up. Shakespeare himself, as we know from Greene's quote, was an actor as well as a playwright. He performed in many different plays, including his own. His most famous role was actually as a ghost, a dead person. He's famous for playing Hamlet's dad. But as a player, as an actor, he was a member of the Lord Chamberlain's Men. And then in 1603, when Elizabeth vacated the scene and was replaced by King James, that group renamed themselves the King's Men. And they were very, very successful, going on to receive a royal patent later that year. Shakespeare, unusually for many writers of the time, continued to act for many, many years, but his final acting references would seem to be around 1609, the same year that bubonic plague swept throughout London, reducing the demand for people on stage. So Shakespeare was an actor, but while that might be how he made his money, it certainly wasn't how he made his legacy. And his legacy comes from his plays. This is how most people will know Shakespeare, and we're indebted to two men in particular, John Hemmings and Henry Candell, who in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare died, commissioned a collection of his plays. There were 36 plays in total, and this was Shakespeare's first folio, one of the rarest and most valuable and most sought after works in the whole of the history of literature. Here you can see the copy of that original engraving. And what I find quite interesting, for the first time, Shakespeare's plays were divided into categories: comedies, histories, and tragedies. Tragedy and comedy followed the Greek stereotype, but histories was something entirely new. There was no equivalent, neither Greek or Roman writing. For me, Shakespeare's greatest works are found in his tragedies. My personal favourite is Othello, but perhaps Shakespeare's greatest gift is the fact he was equally skilled in both comedy and tragedy. He could make you laugh and he could make you cry. Histories tend not to be studied by British school children. They are instead held back for people who go on to study Shakespeare in more detail at university. And I think this is a real shame, because his history plays bring the kings and queens of England to life. And that's what's great about Shakespeare. He shouldn't be read on the page. Our education system loves Shakespeare, but they treat him with very little respect. You shouldn't be reading Shakespeare. You shouldn't force school children to study him for years at a time. They'll learn to hate him. Instead, watch a play. Watch a movie. There is nothing wrong with saying, I've never read Romeo and Juliet, but I've seen the movie instead. In reality, you've probably had an experience closer to that Shakespeare would have wanted. So, I said there were 36 plays in that first folio, but there's a question mark over the number of plays Shakespeare wrote. 36 in the first folio, but that didn't include two that we knew of, Pericles, Prince of Tyre, and the two noble kinsmen. For whatever reason, they were left out. We've also found references to two lost plays, Cardenio and Love's Labour's Won, that rarest of things, a Shakespearean sequel. Looking at all of these together, we would have at least 40 plays by William Shakespeare, rather than the 36 found in this book. Of course, some people will argue that Shakespeare is not responsible for some, or indeed any of his plays. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. I don't believe those people. The first questions about the authenticity of Shakespeare as an author and a writer didn't arrive till over 200 years after his death. So I think the question marks around Shakespeare's heritage is really just revisionist history. There is nothing wrong with Shakespeare writing many plays. He is a polyglot. He is someone who knew a lot of things, but he lived in a bustling city. He would get stories from many people, and it would make sense he would turn them into stage performances. But what has made Shakespeare so successful? Why is he still revered today? Well, for me, it comes down to one thing, and is expressed probably best by Duke Orsino right at the start of Twelfth Night. If music be the food of love, play on. Give me excess of it, because love is at the heart of all of Shakespeare's work and is what gives it such emotion and such virility. Is love a tender thing? Well, love is found throughout his tragedies. Romeo and Juliet, star-crossed lovers, regarded as the quintessential piece of romantic writing. Doesn't end too well, but it's got love at its core. Likewise, in Othello, love is at the heart of it. It's a love that is turned into jealousy, into that green-eyed monster that doth mock the meat it feeds in, but it's there. In Hamlet, the tragedy comes from the love Hamlet has for his father and for his sister. His actions follow in from his distraught, from his revenge at what happens to them. And even in Titus Andronicus, Shakespeare's bloodiest play, a play so violent, it was banned in British schools for decades. All of the, quite frankly, horrific actions that take place in that play come as a result of love and loss. So love is the driver for all of his tragedies. And of course, it's found within his comedies as well. I remember my teacher at school telling me the only difference between a Shakespearean tragedy and a Shakespearean comedy is that in a comedy, the hero somehow manages to survive till the end. I think that's a bit harsh. Yes, Shakespeare transcends the genre between tragedy and comedy, but it is fairly clear which categories they move into. And yes, the misunderstandings in his comedies are played more for laugh than for tragedy, but it'd be easy to imagine that if he was having a slightly worse day when he wrote A Midsummer's Night Dream, that Puck's actions could have resulted in quite a lot of bloodshed. Luckily for us, and for the players in that play, he was in a good mood that day. So, tragedy and comedy. What I find interesting when we look at Shakespeare's plays is that for someone who is considered such an English playwright, he in fact only wrote one tragedy or comedy that was set in England itself. That's the same number as he set in Scotland. It's less than the number he set in Turkey, where 2 of his plays took place. 3 of his plays took place in Greece, and a mighty 10 took place in the land of Italy. Even A Midsummer's Night Dream, the play that is considered the most English of all of his plays, well, that took place on the outskirts of Athens. Why did he do this? Well, abroad was exotic, it was exciting, it was magical, it was mythical, and it would draw in the audience. But I also think there was another reason. By basing his plays abroad, Shakespeare was able to talk about subjects he couldn't have done if they were set in the UK or in England. Now, in Shakespeare's time, we had 2 rulers, 2 monarchs. We had Elizabeth I, and then we had James, who came down from Scotland to rule on the British throne. When Elizabeth was approaching the end of her life, there were question marks over who would follow her, because she had no heir. Who was going to be the next king or queen? But you were not allowed to discuss that. It was a treasonable offence. Talking about the succession could land you in prison. It could have you killed, executed, and that is not an idle threat. One of Shakespeare's contemporary playwrights had his hand chopped off because he questioned the succession in a play. By setting his plays in other countries, Shakespeare was able to talk about the idea of royal succession without being at risk. And in fact, more than 1/4, 25% of his plays feature royal succession questions. So Shakespeare, he lived a little bit dangerously, but he was also a little bit clever. Shakespeare was incredibly successful. Whether it was 40 plays, whether it was more, whether it was less, he was known throughout the land. But nothing lasts forever, and in 1616, he felt the lover's pinch, which means he died. But he died very successful and very wealthy. In fact, he owned the biggest house in all of Stratford. His death was quite sudden. He passed away on the 23rd of April, which was also St. George's Day, perfect for England's national poet. And we know he was wealthy because he left behind his will, where he promised sums of money and objects to various people. One person who was mentioned only once in that will was his wife, Anne Hathaway. She was still around 30 years later. What do you think Shakespeare gave her in his will? Have a guess. Again, the answer might surprise you, because you see, he left her this, a bed. The only thing Anne Hathaway got in Shakespeare's will was his bed, and not his best bed, specifically his second best bed. That doesn't sound so good for 30+ years of marriage, and you might wonder, was something wrong? But in reality, the second best bed was often the matrimonial bed, the one the lovers would use, with the best bed reserved for visitors. So by gifting her the second best bed, he was actually being quite romantic and quite emotional. Plus, she was automatically inheriting half of his estate. So the fact he didn't give her anything else isn't too much of a problem. So he has died, he's passed on. But what is Shakespeare's legacy today? And this is where we're coming to the end of today's talk. Without Shakespeare, we wouldn't have accommodation, birthplace, cat-like, disgraceful, employer, freezing, glow, homely, invitation, jaded, ladybird, or majestic. All of these are words that were created by William Shakespeare. In fact, he created 422 new words never seen before in the English language. He wrote 38 plays, and he composed 154 sonnets. But for me, Shakespeare's legacy cannot be measured by numbers. Instead, the legacy of his work is the way it is still relevant and still being reinterpreted to this day. There's a reason why Hollywood loves Shakespeare. Not only do they remake his plays into blockbuster movies, they reinterpret them, use them as inspiration. I have 3 different movies from different genres on the screen: comedy, musical, science fiction. The plots of all of these are lifted from Shakespeare plays, and it happens all the time in television and film. Shakespeare is at the heart of so much of today's modern entertainment. He can be interpreted in many ways. To some, he's a misogynist. To some, he's a feminist. To some, he is racist. To others, he rails against racism. His plays can be interpreted in hundreds of different ways, and that is their beauty. He is a master of emotion, a master of character, and a master of mystery. More people today watch Shakespeare plays than ever did when he was alive. He has been relevant. He has been at the heart of British culture for 400 years, and I think there's a good chance he'll be there for 400 still to come. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed my talk on William Shakespeare. I hope I've maybe given you a new perspective on the man. And more than anything, I hope you manage to see one of his plays either live, online, or at the cinema. Thank you very much for listening. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. Now, there's been a couple of questions that have come in while we've been talking. So I'm just going to go through just 3 of them very quickly. One person is asking, apart from Othello, what is your favourite Shakespeare play? Again, as I said before, I'm very much into the tragedies, and because I'm Scottish, I've got to say Shakespeare. Not Shakespeare, I've got to say Macbeth. Macbeth is the Scottish play, it's the cursed play, but it's got real bombast to it, real energy. Another question coming in. At what age do you think people should be exposed to Shakespeare? Exposed is an interesting word. I think it depends the way you do it. For me, Shakespeare is best experienced than read. And I would certainly say up until people are late teenage years, don't force them to read the plays. Don't force them to study it as a textbook. Instead, take them through the theatre. Let them watch the films. And you can introduce people to Shakespeare at a very young age. In fact, I'll tell you what, you want to introduce someone to Shakespeare when they're a child, play them The Lion King. It's essentially Hamlet, but with lions. Brilliant. And finally, I'll take one more question. What do you think? What's this? What do you think Shakespeare did in the lost years? Personally, I think he probably was a school teacher. I think he probably spent 3 or 4 years teaching, as people often did from his background. But then I think he moved to London maybe 3 years before we find out from Green. So I think he split his time. Where he taught, I don't know, but I think it's pretty clear he spent some time in the classroom. And I will answer one more. I promised I would stop, but I'm going to answer one more. If we haven't read any of his plays before, which one is the first to read? Which one would you recommend we read first? Interesting. For me, I think the tragedies are more accessible than the comedies, because comedy relies very much on context, and if you have to explain a joke, it's not necessarily funny. I'm going to say read Othello. To me, it's his great work. It's It's accessible. It's not as most complicated, but it has some great characters. And in Iago, the man who, believe it or not, inspired the parrot from Disney's Aladdin, Iago is the greatest villain in all of literature, in my opinion. He is superb. Never before have you hated a man and yet thought, oh, go on, as you would when you read that. But watch it. Before you read a play, watch one. The Royal Shakespeare Company, if you go on YouTube, have many, many plays available. Watch them. Really, really good. That's the way I would say get into Shakespeare that way. Once you've heard a few, once you've seen a few, that's when you should start going to read them afterwards, because you'll understand the flow and the context of the language so much more. So, ladies and gentlemen, as always, it's a pleasure having the chance to speak to you. Next week, I think Susie from Worthing is going to be telling you all about the British royal family. So again, something very, very British, and I hope to see you then. So from me, from Edinburgh, cheers.